The Chattahoochee River winds from the time-weathered Appalachian Mountains to the Gulf of Mexico. It has run this ancient course for millennia, and for millennia it has bound the region together. The river is a life-giving resource that nourishes and sustains the people living along its banks. Here in the lower Chattahoochee River Valley region of Georgia and Alabama, the river has supported dynamic cultures for thousands of years. The region's first inhabitants lived here long before recorded history. As many as 10,000 years ago, native societies flourished, living off the abundance of the land. The valley eventually became one of the largest and most vibrant prehistoric population centers in North America. Archaeologists have found stone tools and ceramics at ceremonial mounds and other sites throughout the region. Virtually everything we know about these first residents comes from these artifacts they left behind. Native societies of the valley first encountered Europeans during the era of the explorers. Later, traders from some of the earliest European settlements along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast made their way inland. They found a thriving and sophisticated society living along the banks of the Chattahoochee River.
The Muskogee, whom the British called Creeks, were a loose confederacy of about a dozen tribes that occupied a wide area of what is now Alabama and Georgia. Two of the most important Creek towns, Lower Creek towns, were Coweta and Casita. The two towns stood fairly close to where Columbus and Phoenix City are today. Coweta was just across the river, and Casita was about 15 miles south.
By the late 1600s, Coweta and Casita had become important centers of international diplomacy and trade. The Creek leaders there held sway over a vast dominion. Spanish, British, and French representatives came together to negotiate with them. It was an interval of international intrigue in which the valley played an important role. So central was the area to the plans of colonial powers that the Spanish constructed an outpost on a bluff overlooking the Chattahoochee. Fort Apalachicola was established in 1689. During this period, a thriving trade existed between the native people and the European settlers. Artifacts recovered near the site of Fort Apalachicola suggest a significant cultural exchange as well. Traditional native folkways melded with European technology. Both cultures were changed as a result. This cultural adaptation grew increasingly one-sided, however. Eventually, land-hungry farmers in growing American settlements to the east began to eye the Creek's rich lands jealously. The Creeks traditionally hunted and practiced small-scale farming. The American government pressured them to adopt intensive agriculture and new ways of life instead. Opposing visions for the future of their people pitted Creek against Creek. Ultimately, Creek society splintered over the issue. War was the result. In the Creek War of 1813 and 14, American forces and their Creek allies fought against Red Stick Creeks. The Red Sticks opposed American interference in tribal affairs. American forces launched two large offensives from Fort Mitchell, which they constructed in the valley during the war near modern Phoenix City. By the end of the conflict, the defeated Creek Nation was devastated. They surrendered millions of acres of their territory. Over the next 2 decades, settlers continued to pressure the Creeks for their few remaining lands. In 1836, the impoverished Creeks tried to strike back. They burned the riverside town of Roanoke to the ground. Americans retaliated during the short but brutal Second Creek War. In its aftermath, the Creeks were forcibly removed from their homelands. In what has become known as the Creek Trail of Tears, they traveled west to the newly designated Indian Territory in current-day Oklahoma. All that remains of them are the names they gave to their communities, their streams, and their rivers. And yet, their legacy endures. With the Creeks gone, Americans flocked to the newly opened lands. New homesteads soon dotted the landscape. Dozens of frontier communities sprang up.
At a series of powerful falls stretching across the Chattahoochee's northernmost navigable point, the Georgia legislature founded a planned town in 1827. Columbus soon became the cultural, economic, and population center of one of the South's most vibrant economic corridors. At the heart of this newfound prosperity was cotton.
Growers transported area cotton from nearly 200 landings along the Apalachicola-Chattahoochee-Flint River system. The end of the river journey was the port of Apalachicola, Florida, on the Gulf of Mexico. The port became one of the most important international export centers in the nation. Steamers and later railroads made the return trip upriver. They brought an array of finished goods from other ports in the United States and from Europe. Eager consumers, part of a dynamic and flourishing antebellum society, purchased food, furniture, interior decorations, clothing, and other items.
Not everyone in the valley enjoyed this prosperity. About half the valley's population had no part in it. By 1860, nearly 90,000 enslaved African Americans called the Chattahoochee Valley region home. Many lived in modest structures like the one you see behind me here. Others lived in much harsher conditions. All were held as mere property. They were sold at auction to the highest bidder. They were forced to labor against their will. These men and women influenced every aspect of life in our valley, tending crops, building structures, and providing labor for a variety of activities throughout the valley. Today, we have only a basic understanding of most slaves' lives and the extraordinary hardships they faced.
Sectional tensions over slavery mounted in the 1850s. Several local leaders like Benjamin Harvey Hill, Henry Benning, and Martin J. Crawford took prominent roles in the national debate. The dispute would lead the nation on a path towards war. Moderate voices warned against war, but the tide of Southern nationalism rose. Local citizens held wild celebrations when Alabama and later Georgia left the Union in 1861. In the devastating Civil War that followed, the Valley contributed both men and material to the Confederate cause. Thousands of troops from throughout the region fought in places such as Antietam, Gettysburg, and Atlanta. On faraway battlefields and in local hospitals, they died by the hundreds. Ceremonies commemorating these men and their service would play a significant role later in creating the National Memorial Day holiday. The booming industrial complex in Columbus brought the war to the region's doorstep. The city was the second largest manufacturing center in the Confederacy. Dozens of Columbus facilities manufactured needed items, uniforms, weapons, and supplies, even an ironclad warship, the CSS Jackson.
As a result of all this manufacturing, Columbus became a target. Union General James Wilson rode with his cavalry corps on Columbus in the spring of 1865. During this raid into the heart of the Confederacy, Wilson split his cavalry troopers into two parts. One division of Wilson's troopers fought a vicious all-day battle at West Point, Georgia, just north of Columbus, for the small fortification of Fort Tyler. Fort Tyler was named for its commander, General Tyler, who became the last general killed in the Civil War. The rest of Wilson's command made their way toward the city of Columbus. Confederate forces met Wilson's troopers in the hills overlooking Columbus in Girard. Girard is today Phoenix City. Wilson's troopers easily overran the ragtag militia. In the last battles of the Civil War, and ironically occurred a week after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The next day, most of Columbus's industrial complex was destroyed.
It took time, but the city made a remarkable recovery. Many Columbus industries were rebuilt and expanded. Over the next few decades, several large textile mills began operation in the city.
If you believe in ghosts, you might feel them here. This is what's left of the Bibb Mill, which was in the 1920s the largest textile operation under one roof in the United States. The mill ran from here all the way to the river, which was a distance of almost a quarter mile. Inside the mill, workers worked on spinning frames, they wove cloth. About 60% of the workers would have been women and children. Workers made maybe $1 a day. And the conditions in the mill were not always great. There was lint in the air that people breathed in, it was noisy. But still, the workers who think back to working in the mill have fond memories. They say that it was like a family. The mills produced a wide range of goods, and they employed thousands of workers. Textile companies operated in cities north of Columbus as well. Valley and Lynette, Alabama, West Point and LaGrange, Georgia, they each boasted their own concentration of mills. The Chattahoochee Valley became one of the largest textile mill manufacturing centers in the country.
With the hum of the mills in the background, the region began a remarkable coming of age. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, local entrepreneurs launched businesses that would put the region on the national map. The early decades of the 20th century saw rare artistic talents like screenwriter Nunnally Johnson, author Carson McCullers, and blues musician Ma Rainey give the valley a special place in American culture. Soon the world was on the verge of war. Between World War I and World War II, a sleepy army camp outside of Columbus would be transformed into Fort Benning. It became one of the nation's most important military training centers. Under the watchful eye of esteemed military leaders, Fort Benning trained thousands of men to fight in World War II. While the conflict raged, President Franklin D. Roosevelt visited his Little White House in nearby Warm Springs. In peaceful seclusion on the heights of Pine Mountain, Roosevelt made decisions that altered world history. The close of World War II ushered in a welcome season of peace and prosperity. But the post-war calm was brief. The 1950s and 1960s were an era of tremendous turmoil.
The Chattahoochee Valley witnessed both the best and the worst of the civil rights movement. Local activists challenged Georgia's whites-only Democratic Party. Their success was one of the many noteworthy victories in the fight for civil rights. Courageous leaders in the Valley challenged white supremacy legally and peacefully, but violence came as well. Dr. Thomas Brewer, a physician and respected local leader, helped found the Columbus chapter of the NAACP. Dr. Thomas Brewer was shot and killed in downtown Columbus in 1956, a sad day. It was a turning point for my generation. Perhaps the most important years of my life.
Another violent act, just 2 years prior to Brewer's death, put the valley in the national spotlight. For decades, a criminal syndicate specializing in illegal gambling had operated in Phoenix City, Alabama. The resulting corruption gave the town an unwanted reputation as Sin City. The racketeers behind it exerted tremendous influence in city affairs. Phoenix City Attorney Albert Patterson dared to stand up to the syndicate. He ran for the office of Attorney General of Alabama on a ballot for change. He was murdered in cold blood. In the chaos that followed, officials called in the National Guard to restore order. Hollywood found the story irresistible. The movie The Phoenix City Story was based loosely on what had occurred. Released in 1955, it brought the town additional unwanted notoriety.
Well, aren't you going to stop him?
No.
Why not?
That's young Patterson. You want to invite his dad to go in with Gage's bunch?
Now that notoriety spread pretty far. I saw the Phoenix City Story in 1955 in the Army Theater in Munich, Germany. There I sat with my Army buddy seeing Columbus and Phoenix City on that big screen and all of that notoriety. But in the end, the good people of Phoenix City prevailed. Phoenix City grew and is now a vibrant, thriving community.
The valley emerged from this tumultuous time into an era of dynamic growth and remarkable change. As progress and modern development threatened community landmarks, groups throughout the region came together to preserve the area's unique character. They saved local treasures for future generations. They formed vibrant cultural institutions, such as the Columbus Museum, originally called the Bradley Museum. The community found ways to share its appreciation for the past and celebrate the arts.
The year was 1964, and the Springer had been abandoned for approximately 8 years. And downtown Columbus had been being abandoned for the past 20 years, I suppose. And yet, the need to preserve and save the Springer Opera House was very evident. So a group of people started into the project, and we opened a year and a half later, and the Springer's quote-unquote success became the start of a preservation movement in downtown Columbus specifically.
In recent decades, the valley stepped onto the world stage. In 1977, a peanut farmer from a small town nearby was elected to the White House. In 1996, the Valley hosted sites for the International Olympic Games. Large international corporations, some with local roots, have radically changed the area's economy. With the expansion of Fort Benning, the Valley is home to one of the world's largest and most sophisticated military installations. The Valley's unique culture, architecture, and landscape delight visitors and residents alike. Informed and inspired by its rich past, the region looks forward to the future and the new chapters in the Chattahoochee Valley story waiting to be written.